I would like to welcome Brett Frischmann on the stage. We are extremely happy to have you here. Brett Frischmann is a renowned scholar and currently a professor in law, business, and economics at the Charles Witschger School of Law at Villanova University. And he is also an affiliate scholar of the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School and a trustee for the Nexa Center for Internet and Society in Torino in Italy. He's worked extensively on intellectual property and internet law, infrastructure, and that's why we invited him here, on knowledge commons. He's also published extensively in leading journals and also has published a number of books, most recently Re-Engineering Humanity, which explores the relationship between the techno-social world and humanity. And yeah, we invited him here to share his insights on knowledge commons. He's been strongly involved in the workshop on governing knowledge commons, which is, as I understand it, inspired by the workshop on the commons, and is a virtual, collaborative, and interdisciplinary research project. And they've made a major contribution to conceptualize knowledge commons, which has also flown into a number of publications, among them a book on governing knowledge commons, which includes the knowledge commons framework and also very detailed case studies on a variety of scientific and cultural domains. So we are very delighted to have you here, and I give you the floor now. So we are very excited to hear your presentation.
Great, thanks. All right, well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was saying to Julia just before we started that it's the conference is very poorly. One of the problems with the conference is there's too many good papers, and all of the sessions that are joined, I can't choose between them, and that's a good problem to have at a conference, as you all know. So I'm excited for the next 2 days to hear your thoughts. And if I miss your session, please come tell me in the breaks or at lunch. I'd love to hear about the papers that I missed and what you're doing. And so I'm going to try to make sure I sit with people that I don't, if I'm not in your session, because I think it's just so much good stuff going on. All right, so I do 3 different things, and they all relate to each other, even though no one thinks they do. But I can see it somehow in the back of my mind. I can always sort of see the connections. So I do work on infrastructure, infrastructure economics, really infrastructure commons, sort of managing various infrastructural resources in a non-discriminatory way, and from things as wide-ranging as roads and the electricity grid to basic research and ideas and the internet. And what's interesting is the infrastructure book, which came out, I think, in 2012. In many ways, I was very optimistic about the world, very optimistic about the internet in particular, and there's a whole chapter at the end sort of talking about all the various platforms on the internet and how great and how the social value that comes from having an open internet and open systems. The various commons that exist at different layers of the internet, and sort of made connections with other infrastructural systems where there also are commons at different layers. And then I wrote this book, which just came out last month, on Re-Engineering Humanity. It may be a little bit more pessimistic about the world we're building and how the technosocial world we're building affects who we are as human beings, the world available, the opportunities available for ourselves, our children, and for future generations. And it talks quite a bit about the intergenerational commitments we have when we're engaged in world building, both through our technical and through our social institutions. And so I was at an OECD conference about data sharing and knowledge, giving a keynote sort of like this. And I opened with the same slide and opened with a similar pitch and said, one of the surprising solutions that is now people are starting to realize is a possible way to go about dealing with surveillance capitalism and some of the issues we're having with our information economy may be knowledge commons, may be trusted governance systems where communities manage a set of knowledge, data, and other resources, rather than relying on top-down government management or sort of privatized market-oriented management of various resources. So figuring out how to do governance of various sets of knowledge and data resources may be sort of a way forward in terms of getting the most out of the infrastructure systems we have. So on net, I'm still net optimist about the world we're building and where we're headed. We can still build a great world for ourselves and for our children and future generations. But it's not inevitable. Technology won't necessarily deliver. And so one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time lately thinking about is sort of how governance can work, and sort of lessons from the knowledge commons and more broader the commons literature for that can be sort of used to manage resources more generally. All right, so that's not really what I'm here to talk about, except I just want to make the pitch that sort of there's importance to systematically studying governance institutions, the ways that communities get together and actually effectively get over social dilemmas, solve problems collectively. There's reasons we want to systematically study these governance institutions because they can have broader impact on the world than just our narrow focus that you might be interested in, right? So a lot of us come to Knowledge Commons or to Seed Commons or to another area. We're interested in a particular kind of problem and we want to figure it out. But there's lots of, if we can think about how to generalize from a whole bunch of different case studies and a whole bunch of different situations, we may learn something about governance more generally. So the Knowledge Commons Studies is really this project with Mike Madison, Kathy Strandberg, and many, many others. In a sense, Yochai Benkler, who some of us were talking about before, at an earlier conference, characterized this as sort of a mini-field or a subfield that's sort of emerging, which we're trying to build. We're building our own knowledge commons about knowledge commons, in a sense, building a community of people who want to study and collectively share information and lessons about what works and what doesn't work in this space. So it's increasingly, not only is it interdisciplinary, and I'll show you some of the contributions in these other books from different disciplines, but it's also international and it's relatively open. So we're always sort of encouraging participation, trying to bring more people into the fold, I guess. So it started with governing knowledge. Well, I mean, it didn't really start with governing knowledge commons. It started with papers and discussions, published papers and discussions that go back 20 years, and a Cornell Law Review article, really an issue of the Cornell Law Review, in which we first sketched out constructed commons in the cultural environment and then had a bunch of responses from Eleanor Ostrom and Thoreen Egerton and a whole bunch of other people interested in commons sort of start thinking through what it might mean to systematically study knowledge commons. That culminated in this first book, Governing Knowledge Commons, in which we develop a framework, adapt it, and I'll talk about that in just a second. I'll give you some pictures and talk about it a bit more. And a series of case studies. Governing Medical Knowledge Commons, the book that just came out last year. A series of case studies applying that same framework to a whole host of case studies in the knowledge domain, medical knowledge domain. But we've just recently established a book series with Cambridge, and we are adding to, or developing more manuscripts, more collections of case studies. My long-term goal, as I sometimes will say, is I don't think about what I can learn tomorrow. So when the OECD at this meeting said, okay, so tell us, what should we do? What are the design principles? I said, I don't know. I don't know yet. We need to study this. So my goal is to get funding from the OECD. I can maybe do it quicker, but it's not coming. But the idea would be to, in 10 years, so I tend to think very long, I'm okay with that. If in 10 years we can have hundreds of case studies that are systematically done using the same framework, then maybe we can start to generalize and sort of sort of figure out some more design principles. Some people said I'm waiting too long, we should do it earlier. I'm happy to hear what people think about that. But this is sort of a way that we're going about sort of doing the study, doing the social science and the study of governance over time with lots of people so that we can actually make some progress. And I'll talk about some other books that we have on the way. So the next forthcoming research that we're doing. But I'll talk mostly about the Governing Knowledge Commons project. But before I get into that, I want to be clear about what I mean, because even in this room, I bet there are at least 6 different understandings, if not more, about what commons is. When I say commons, it can mean different things. Even in this room of experts, with people who study it systematically all the time. Right? Do you all have that same sense? Okay, so it's not just me. I mean, so I'm going to just tell you what I mean. And we can dispute I don't usually like getting into big definitional debates about the semantics of the words, but it does matter that you understand what we think commons are when we're talking about it. And I try to persuade people that I'm right, and like this is the better approach, but we can go there. So what is a commons? I'm going to show you a couple slides on this, right? This is our definition that we use, that we sort of spell out at length in the Governing Knowledge Commons book and expand upon and try to defend, right? So commons is a form of community management or governance, applies to resources, involves a group of community people, but does not denote the resource. So commons isn't a thing. It's not the resource. It's not the community. It's not a place, right? It's not the thing. The commons is the institutional arrangement of these things. Okay? And so we end up focusing on this one characteristic, especially for knowledge. This is important. Commons from non-commons is institutionalized sharing of resources among members of a community. Okay, so it's governance of a shared resource within a community. Okay? And the key thing is commons governance is used by a wide variety of communities for many different types of resources. The type of resource, the nature of the community, what their goals and objectives are, really matters for what the governance institutions are going to look like. There's variance. There's demand for different governance solutions within commons frameworks or commons groups to overcome certain kinds of dilemmas. And I'm going to talk about what those might be and how we learn about those through some of these knowledge commons studies. There are lots of different obstacles. You're going to see this later on in a different form. All right, so what is a commons? We might just say commons are resource management or governance institutions that enable sustainable shared use of resources. That can be different kinds of things. They can be knowledge, they can be seeds, they can be different things within a community. For our purposes, when I use the word knowledge, and this is just, we have to use some word. We used to talk about commons in the cultural environment, and that became too wordy. It's hard to say over and over again. People got confused about we wanted to debate the definition of culture. And so we moved away from, that was sort of the earlier work, we moved away from cultural environment and said, look, we're just going to use knowledge as the placeholder for intellectual resources, human-made intellectual resources. So it's inclusive of a wide range of intellectual resources. So it includes things like data, but it also includes basic research. It can include patented inventions. So if you have a patent pool, that can be a knowledge commons. Okay? So we're using this pretty broadly. And in fact, many knowledge commons involve many different types of knowledge resources. It's not just the data that ends up mattering. Why commons? There's lots of reasons why, but knowledge resources, what's interesting about commons governance of knowledge in particular is that the resources are both inputs and outputs of complex resource systems. Right? So knowledge resources are often inputs to the production of more knowledge resources in a cumulative way over time. And it's often, there are multiple inputs and multiple outputs. And so actually the funny thing is in the infrastructure book that I mentioned earlier, there's a whole chapter on intellectual infrastructure that goes through and really lays out the complex economics and functional relationship in sort of trying to get a sense of these complex resource systems. For those who are interested. And so there are many shared resources when we're talking about knowledge resources are in fact infrastructural, meaning they are shareable inputs into a wide variety of productive activities that yield many different kinds of outputs. They're general purpose shareable inputs. And because many knowledge resources are general purpose shareable inputs, there's a economic and social case to be made for sharing them as much as you can. And commons helps that happen. Okay. Another reason why commons is useful to think about with regard to knowledge generally, remember thinking broadly about what knowledge means, is that knowledge communities both define and are defined by commons. Right? Participating in governance within certain knowledge communities sort of defines what the community is. Right? So the scientific community often sort of defines itself by its governance institutions. You're sort of outside the scientific community when you stop participating or abiding by the norms that the community respects. And so that's kind of an interesting dynamic. And commons helps facilitate that community definition question. And then the other thing that's often sort of forgotten is there are many different social dilemmas that commons can help overcome. It's not, and I'll say a bit more about this in just a second, but it's not just a simple free rider problem or congestion problem or a depletion of a partially or potentially rivalrous resource problem. That's sometimes often an important motivating factor, but it's not usually the only social dilemma or obstacle to cooperation in these communities. And so studying systematically what these communities face often requires a constantly making yourself aware of the fact that there are a variety of different dilemmas that create, in a sense, demand for governance. Okay? All right, so how commons? Well, sometimes people think, well, it's commons like as if open access is a bad thing. You know, we're always talking about sort of, constrained or managed access or governed access. You know, look, open access actually works for some resources. Open access is a useful governance regime for some infrastructural resources, for example. When the members, think about the community, what's the community for the electricity grid? Or what's the community for a highway system? Well, the community is, in a sense, the public at large. When the public at large is the relevant community, open access sometimes is what you want to aim for. Open, non-discriminatory access for everyone, because you're thinking about a different kind of community. You're sort of thinking of but the thing is, in that category, it's sometimes useful to think of it as a commons because it connects the governance questions. But for most of the things that we're talking about in terms of knowledge commons, governance tends to be quite complex. It's contextual. It's sort of specific to the resources we're talking about. It's specific to the relevant community. And so we really want to think about the how commons question, how we're going to govern the resources and construct the community over time, ends up being sort of context and resource specific. It's much more than just openness. There are many different dilemmas, and so the demand for governance means that it tends to vary in terms of how we're actually going to successfully manage the resource. All right, just pardon me when I take a quick sip. All right, so what was motivating us? Well, look, I initially, now I don't even know what I am anymore, but I used to be, or I still am, an intellectual property lawyer, an intellectual property scholar. I write about copyright and patent, trade secrecy, things like that. That is also true of Mike Madison and Kathy Strandberg. We also each of us bring slightly different disciplinary backgrounds to the table, besides law. But initially, when we started thinking about this in our little three-person group in the late 90s, we were thinking about it from an IP perspective. That intellectual property theory, the idea that you grant a patent or grant a copyright to overcome a free rider dilemma with respect to a public good, makes sense sometimes, but the theory sort of behind intellectual property was much too simple. And economists and and lawyers and legal scholars have known this for a very long time. We talk about it all the time, and yet we don't really make a whole lot of progress in developing our understanding about the knowledge resources and IP theory. That's part of the motivation. Another part of the motivation is that there are lots of sort of things emerging, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, and whether it's Wikipedia or sort of these open, non-market, not quite public domains or things happening. And there are a lot of people sort of talking about this in the IP literature as sort of, now we don't need any IP anymore. We've got something new. This is going to, and it's not true. It's sort of a more balanced thing. But there's this attraction to, they weren't quite putting the finger on commons exactly, but attraction to this new thing made possible, you might think, by the internet. Okay? And the thing is, a lot of people started doing these one-off studies. Like, I'm interested in patent pools, or I'm interested in Wikipedia, or I'm interested in some other example. And you get a bunch of one-off case studies. I think I said this to people in the meeting right before the meeting started. If you went in 2005 or 2003 and you took a bunch of collection of random papers published about open this or open that, or something that you arguably is really talking about a knowledge commons of one form or another, open source software, something, and you threw them on a table and shuffled them around, and you randomly picked out 10, and then you sort of said, what do these 10 papers have in common? It would be very little. In other words, they asked, the researcher or the writer would not be asking the same set of questions in each of those 10 different case studies because they had no framework motivating them. They were interested in what they were interested in. So if you got a patent lawyer talking about a patent pool, they're interested in what the patents are. Right? What are the inventions? What do the licensing arrangements look like? They're not thinking about the tacit knowledge or the negative information, like information about failed research. And they're not interested in anyone besides the patent lawyers. They're not necessarily interested in the inventors or the staff, right? Or the marketing group that sort of appears and shows up at some of those meetings. Like, they're not interested in all of the other, because the patent lawyer has no reason to think that those other things might be important. And yet, if you want to study the governance of a patent pool as a knowledge commons, you might want to pay attention to some of those other actors, some of those other resources, and maybe some of the other rules, whether they're informal norms or they're formal rules put into the patent pool arrangement, right? And so, again, we kind of look at seeing these one-off case studies and saying they're insufficient to sort of allow us to learn about governance. And so we were motivated to sort of, how are we going to systematize the inquiry? And so early on, I've been drawn to Ostrom's work since, since graduate school in engineering, before I even went to law school. So I've always been following and reading and sort of thinking about, and we met with her early on and sort of started exploring the idea of using Ostrom's approach. And I can go on and on about Lynn Ostrom and how amazing she was, both in terms of her research and in terms of her method and in terms of how she built communities and in terms of how she helped me as a person, as a young scholar, all kinds of stuff. So I almost think of what I try to do is sort of just do what she did to the best I can. That's my ability. It's sort of, that's what I feel like I'm always trying to do when I'm thinking about knowledge commons. Put aside that, and just in terms of her approach to the study. So I think her approach to sort of building a community of research is pretty amazing too, but that's a separate talk. But constructing a framework to guide case studies, to help us figure out what questions to ask, right, without sort of prejudging, right, what's going to be important. That's pretty important. Sort of it's a given in social science that that's how you might go about it, but people don't always start with a framework. So if you look at back and sort of think, we need a framework that's going to allow for many different theories, allow for different models to exist, right? And we're sort of open up the empirical inquiry. It's also interesting how it's a long-term perspective. It's not doing a research project so we can have an answer tomorrow or next year or even in the next 3 years. Organizes your empirical inquiry by sort of trying to figure out different variables, different questions to ask, what the relationships might be, and so you can do some comparative work. How many, as you guys are all, you probably know this better than I do, right? Everyone in this room is familiar with the IAD framework. Yes? Is anyone not? Okay, that whenever speakers do that, it's the most awful thing. Who's going to say, yeah, everyone should know this, but I don't. Yes. Especially in this room. So, that's awful. Sorry. Edit that out of the transcript if you're... all right. So the framework... look, we could have done the social ecological... There's other more advanced stuff, frameworks for studying, for doing this kind of work that we could have... But we went back to the ID and stuck with the ID for reasons that partly it's the simplicity, partly it's sufficient for guiding the inquiry for studying knowledge commons. She actually thought it made sense when we sort of were talking about it at length, heard that it made sense to sort of extend the IED framework. I'm going to talk to you about why we needed to make some changes, subtle changes. But what's neat about it, and you guys all know this, you can use it to study so many different phenomena where you care about people, environment, rules, governance rules, over time, right, so that you can draw out lessons. So, I'm not going to go through this with you here, but I often, for people who don't know anything about it, will sort of walk through sort of soccer as an example. The difference between studying the rules in a local community in the United States versus the EPL or something, or European Professional League soccer. And you can actually learn something about the difference in governance rules and why it matters what the levels of play are, and the difference between amateur and professional. And there's there's an interesting way to think through. And this framework can help you to sort of see how you might do that study. And so if you're not a commons person, it's sort of useful to sometimes use a sport, or you could use something else, just to show how it helps you just organize your thoughts. But of course, you can use it for lots of things. Now, I'm not going to repeat things I suspect people know, but there's these design principles that emerge from Ostrom's work. They're design principles. They're not they're not more than that. Our approach is similar, but what I want to emphasize is that we're going to find some of the same design principles, I suspect, are relevant in knowledge commons, but not necessarily the same, not necessarily the same degree. There may be others, right? And one reason to suspect that there will be others is that the resources are different in really important ways. We create knowledge. It's a human-made resource, but also because of its cumulative nature, the cumulative nature of the resource. So we have to create and then curate, manage. Is there something back there? Oh.
Sorry.
So we have to. Is there someone lurking? So we have to curate and manage the resources in ways that's not just managing them that already exist, but we're also adding to, right? And so we have to deal with some of those kinds of incentives. And also, non-rivalry also suggests that more the merrier phenomena exist. When possible, right, we want to take advantage of the non-rivalrous nature of intellectual resources, which means because it's not consumed upon use, we actually want to maximize its use within the community when we can, right? Take into account whatever dilemmas we might face. And that's different from many of the natural resource contexts that Ostrom and colleagues studied. So one thing we had to do is we had to think about how actions are themselves producing resources, remember I talked about how the community, scientific communities in part define. So there's some of the resource characteristics and attributes of the community sort of end up blurring and having a dynamic relationship with each other. Outcomes themselves are resources that get fed back in to the environment. And so these are just some of the subtle, we talk about this in the Governing Knowledge Commons book itself a little bit more, but these are some of the subtle things that mean, we might make a few little changes in terms of the kinds of questions you want to ask. Right? So dynamically over time, how are the resources sort of feeding back and reconstituting the resource pool? You should never put this much text on a slide. The rule.
Thank you.
Too much text. Just note the structure. I'm going to go back so you can see it a little more because we've got time. But it's really the structure of the approach, right? And we've actually added some in the medical knowledge commons. We learned something from the first book, and sort of were able to sort of figure out that we had to add something about shared infrastructure. And so some questions were added as we're going forward. But this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of, just in terms of when you're doing interviews. So I'm doing interview. I'll tell you a little bit about it. That's something I'm doing in a few minutes. But when you're thinking about doing interviews, or you're thinking about doing a document review, or you're thinking about designing a survey, this is to help you orient the kinds of questions you might want to think about asking. So again, and it's all motivated by an analysis of this. Right. So what's the So one of the things that often is interesting in the knowledge commons is thinking about the background context, the legal or cultural context. Are things already in the public domain, or are they copyrighted? For example, to begin with, if you're constructing a commons with resources that are otherwise covered by copyright, you might think of that differently than you think about something that's natural facts, which are naturally in the public domain. Anyway, so I won't go so much through all of this, because again, I told you the text doesn't matter. It's really the structure I want you to see. But it's sort of the attributes of the commons, the resources of the community members, what are the goals and objectives. We even have a whole thing on the history and narrative of the commons for sort of when you're thinking about where the community comes from, how did it identify the kinds of dilemmas that it faces, ends up being quite important, sort of uncovering how governance institutions evolve over time. And then in terms of governance, these are some of the examples of the things we would ask about, and then patterns of outcomes. None of these specifics should be surprising to you. These are just sort of the organized in a broad set of questions that we're trying to ask. And I'm happy to share the slides so if people want to sort of look at this. A lot of this is also straight out of the book. But I should say, this is actually on a one-sheeter. The other thing we try to do is when we're trying to encourage people to participate, to do case studies, or people coming to a conference that we're hosting where we're trying to present papers and things, we'll often put this on one page. So we're like, can we boil down this set of questions that someone can just look at to one pager? And so it's not good on a slide, but it is good on like a one page that you can hand out. All right, so the Governing Knowledge Commons book itself had a variety of different contributors from a variety of different disciplines, a few legal scholars, some economists, some engineers, historian, an economist from the Bureau of Labor who did some airplane inventions, a historical study. That's one thing I want to emphasize. The other thing I want to emphasize is we also tried in the first book to be relatively broad in terms of the range of case studies. So some of them are kind of nuts, or sort of out there at the fringes, like roller derby names and Congress as a commons, as a knowledge commons. So how Congress is structured to share information according to certain norms, governance institutions, military technology journalism, airplane inventions, user innovations, online creation communities, but astronomical data. My study with Catherine Stanberg and John Kui was a rare disease research consortium. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. The second book is all knowledge commons that are focused in the medical area. Some of it's about user innovation, commons that involve user innovation. Some of it is, so again, you can see a variety. And again, I think you could do multiple medical knowledge commons books. There's so much more to do. And even in some of these, there's multiple genomic data commons comes up here, but it also came up in the previous one. So there's much to be learned by doing multiple case studies, even in a particular area. But again, it's to sort of highlight the variety, even within the medical field, of the kinds of knowledge commons that one can do. And again, even here, we have lawyers, economists, doctors, sort of a variety of people from different disciplines coming together, sort of thinking about they want to study something systematically, come together. And I should say something about the way we've been approaching this. So we have a book series. What we often do is we have a conference where people present drafts. We invite people to the conference. But we send them a bit of description about the Governing Knowledge Commons framework, right? And then at the conference, people present drafts, get together, comment on each other's drafts, and then over the next year, we're doing some exchange of drafts. And then when the final drafts come in, we publish them as a book. It's sort of the way that we're bringing people together over time. So I want to talk a little bit. How am I doing on time? Actually, I wasn't paying attention. Fine. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the themes from some of the case studies and then sort of illustrate them with examples. So some of the themes from the first book of case studies that also sort of follow down in the medical commons too. So now these are themes. We were very unsure about what we could draw from our limited set of case studies the first go around. So what we wanted to do was say, draw out themes that emerge from the small number of cases, but these are not empirical findings, and they're not design principles or anything like that. These are the things that surfaced in many of the different case studies that we thought would be worth highlighting and potentially revisiting or thinking about as we're doing further study. So one is that there are diverse obstacles or social dilemmas. So all of the case studies had demonstrated there was much more than a free rider dilemma to confront. And so I'll quickly sort of explain this through my own case studies on rare disease. So I've done 2 case studies on rare disease research consortia, the urea cycle disorder consortium, and this mitochondrial disease consortium, and in the 2 books. And what's interesting about rare diseases, the rare disease problem, is the rare disease problem, like doing disease, the research itself has all of the conventional production of a public good story. Like that exists, right? But there's some additional complications in the rare disease context, right? There's very few patients per disease, right? They tend to be spread out geographically, right? They're not all located in one particular place. So they're scattered, which means that the people treating them, the clinicians, are scattered as well, that they don't necessarily know each other. There's no blockbuster pharma profits, so there's really no draw for pharma to be studying these things, although there's nothing more that these communities want than to have a pharma company come in and develop a drug to help, right? So part of the motivation is to reduce the costs for pharma. I'll come back to that in just a second. And one of the interesting things about rare diseases is that if we think about personalized medicine going forward, many things we don't think of as rare diseases right now may start to look like rare diseases. So studying rare diseases might be useful to provide sort of some lessons for how to govern research when we get to the personalized medicine world. But this is a question mark. I'm not so sure. I'm not 100% sure about this. But some of the requirements to develop research about diagnosis, about treatment, right, is you need to be able to recruit patients. And again, they're geographically spread. There aren't many of them. You've got to identify them and figure out a way to sort of bring them together for both the studies and for drug trials. You've got another one that's often overlooked is you have to figure out a protocol. You have to standardize your protocols for the studies you're running, for the tests you're running, for the data collection. And again, when they're small numbers, right, that requires you to think differently about the data that you're collecting. And the data, when it's collected by distributed clinicians for whom the patient may be 1%, 5% of their workload, so it's not something that they're just dealing with this particular kind of patient all the time, right? Thinking about how you standardize data collection and treatment and stuff can be difficult. But it's got to be done if you want to do research. And then you've got to figure out a way to get people to cooperate. Clinicians and patients and families have to sort of see themselves as coming together to solve a problem together. So the problem, again, is more than just a free rider problem or a public, incentives to produce a public good problem. There's a collective action, cooperation, there's other things going on. So one of the things that the NIH has done is it created this rare disease clinical research network, which is a network of consortia, okay, in part to help explore methods for doing research, establish some of the shared resources or the infrastructure that we might need. In other words, help to figure out how to standardize protocols, how should we standardize database and statistical analysis, database creation, management, as well as statistical analysis. And then also, are there ways we can figure out how to overcome some of these issues that are special for rare diseases? All of those are just diverse, different dilemmas that require governance institutions that are different. Another thing that came up in a bunch of them is that they're complex nested systems. There's commons at different levels. So I'm just going to illustrate this real quickly with the rare disease context. So at the rare disease clinical research, the national level, the macro scale, you've got a knowledge commons. Right? You've got commons that the members of the commons are all the different research consortia themselves. Right? There's a steering committee. The NIH sort of plays a role in terms of this particular office. The patient advocacy groups have a coalition that comes together with representatives who participate at this level. Right? Again, solving certain kinds of knowledge coordination problems and standardization problems. But if you zoom in on UCDC or NAMDAC, one of the case studies we've done, so more meso level, you've got another knowledge commons. Right, at this level, the members are the clinical research sites, right? All the clinicians, the particular research sites that are geographically distributed around the country. You also have members which include the pharma companies sometimes, more than one sometimes, will participate in calls, will participate in this commons, different roles. There's 2 NIH officers who are actually embedded in the community and play a direct role, participate in grant writing, and other things. And then you've got particular parties, like there's a study coordinator, consortium PIs, which are the PIs of each of these sites, etc. So you end up having a knowledge commons. This is the one we study at length in our case studies. But even if you zoom in on a particular clinical research site, say at a hospital or a university hospital, again, you've got a smaller scale at the micro level, you have another knowledge commons. Different parties, different roles, different people playing a role. This isn't what we studied, except indirectly by studying the meso-level. But again, it's very interesting. This kind of nested structure exists in lots of the different case studies. Time-wise, I'm going to skip some of this. There's, and do them quickly. There's infrastructure. Governance evolves over time. You see that early stage versus more mature and developed commons communities sort of figure things out differently and struggle with different things. So here are just some of the main objectives. Many of these can be translated into sort of infrastructural concerns, like how to build the basic infrastructure to do research. One of the things I want to highlight, that this comes out from our framework, from the framework and sort of the approach we take. There's lots of different resources and outcomes to look at. Lots of different resources. There's not one particular resource that's managed or governed as commons. In other words, there's a system, a complex system of related, interdependent resources that we're governing and managing by many different types of actors. There's a tendency to think, okay, we're talking about a rare disease research. It's either the clinicians or the clinical researchers and the patients we talk about. But you know who's really important? What holds things together? They tend to be women who get their work usually gets sidelined and doesn't get counted, are the study coordinator and the site coordinators. Having really good people who are coordinating the efforts, the intake of data, managing the relationship with the patients, incredibly important, we found, in both of our studies, and yet often easily ignored, certainly ignored if you just come at it from a research perspective. And then there's others. The NIH officials actually are really important players in these little in the commons, and then many different action situations. So if you're thinking about the how to apply, think about different action arenas. It turns out there are many that occur. I know time-wise, I don't have time to go through all of this, but we organize in different categories. You might just focus on one. There's lots of different ones, but one that helps me illustrate one of the other themes. Developing this research diagnostic criteria. So in order to NAMDAC is a new emerging knowledge commons. Mitochondrial disease research is relatively new phenomena, right? It's a new kind of science. This group was new in 2010, 2012 sort of time frame. And so because it's new medical science, there's clinical diagnosis is one thing. Research diagnosis that's sufficient to enter data into a database used for data mining and research is a different thing. And so the community had to struggle with, what do we do when we have different clinical and research diagnostic criteria? How do we match up the data that we're actually getting at the local level is clinical research data, but we need it to be of a certain quality and of a certain type for it to be useful and entered into a database. There's too many errors that get introduced for research purposes. And so it wouldn't actually, for example, attract a pharma company and lower the cost of doing clinical trials if it's not up to standard. And so this is one of their big struggles because they're new. They create a committee to handle it. And I just want to say that the bottom line is it's its own complex knowledge dilemma requiring governance and a solution, and it's a precursor to all these other things that the community wants to do. All right, so I'm being told to wrap up, so I'm not going to tell you at all about this entirely new project about privacy as commons, but I'm just going to I'll jump to the punchline. So we're doing a conference at Villanova in October studying privacy as commons. This is my particular case study that I'm doing that will be in the book. Remember this. Same definition. Replace the word commons with privacy, and it makes perfect sense. It still fits. Whenever you, often at least, when you talk about privacy, you're talking about n greater than 1 and less than infinity. So members sharing information. Your community definition may be 5 people, or it may be larger. It's often about governance. And so privacy often is a form of a commons. And so this is what I want to get at is what I opened with, which is a lot of the problems we're struggling with in terms of our networked information economy might be addressable if we figure out how to do privacy/commons governance well. And so this is one of the things that we're studying going forward. So I'll stop. This is kind of the point I was making here. and just leave with a sense of the future, which is more case studies, more books, connecting up with the trying to figure out how to make these kinds of connections like this we're doing today, and just welcome you to sort of get in touch. So
thanks a lot for your presentation. Maybe we collect a few, 2 or 3 questions, and then give Pat the chance to answer.
Thanks a lot for this inspiring talk, running us through the postron logic. When you come to, well, I guess the findings to some extent, your description of the knowledge commons emerges, I think, that the framework you presented is not really doing justice to the complexity that you found. So I'm wondering how you relate your research to this, you're very well aware, to this other concept, this overarching concept that Bjorström's developed in the very beginning, and people now start to take up again in the literature of polycentricity, which relates to this complexity of many resources, many actors, there's interrelations, etc. So I'm wondering if you bring that in, what that raises as questions.
Great question. I'll answer it quick because I can do it quickly. Yes and no. So we're aware of that, and we talked about it a bunch. It's come up at the Ostrom workshop when we were sort of talking through this stuff, but we haven't yet figured out how to sort of line them up together and to integrate. So if it's certainly something that's like on the table, but not, and you're right, your observation is exactly right. The framework helps us ask the right question, investigate, and we're learning, and then you're right, what we're uncovering, which isn't surprising, is that it's a really complicated, multi-level thing and dynamic over time, and so it's good that we're learning that, and yet we haven't gone back and sort of connected it. It comes up often. It's a good question.
Thanks for this talk. I especially appreciated what you said about the role of frameworks and also how you went into the neglected diseases. And I very much appreciate the DNDi approach, so I'd like to talk about this a little further later on. Mm-hmm. But my concern is with regard to the role of frameworks, which I share, but what happens if the framework is based on wrong assumptions, or if the framework is built on categories and approaches that kind of don't reflect reality. And what I'm saying here is that I'm always puzzled that when the knowledge commons are supposed to be a known category, and the natural commons or traditional commons are supposed to be another category. I'll certainly have the opportunity to kind of challenge this tomorrow in my keynote, but I would like to start thinking about that basic idea, which is a basic idea for me to say there is no such thing as the knowledge commons on one side and the natural resource commons on the other. Each commons is based on material resources, and each commons is a knowledge commons, and most of all, each commons is a social activity. So what happens with all this if we, rather than looking at commons as management of resources, we truly take that idea that commons is first and foremost commoning seriously and look at it as a way of acting. And I was struck by your last slide, where you came up with that idea that we could govern markets as knowledge commons. I mean, if commons is a way of acting, then it's certainly a different way of acting than acting on the market producing commodities. So then I get really puzzled that we want to analyze the governing of markets as commons. Then I get really confused, and I think it has to do with the way you've built up the framework.
Right. Let me just respond to both points. I think there's 2 main points, and I'll do the second one first. This is a proposal for a book and a conference that a bunch of economists submitted, and it's pretty interesting. It's that many of the norms, rules of the game in markets are created through a knowledge commons. Okay, so communities of actors acting to generate shareable resources that we all then become the rules of the game. Social. So I may do a case study in here about common sense and social norms and how those relate. So as a knowledge commons that produces the shareable rules of the game within markets, but also outside of markets, is maybe what I focus on. So that's what that is about. It's not that markets are governed by broader principles, right, and certain price mechanism, and things like that. But it's about that's what they're focused on. I couldn't agree more with you that a strict dichotomy of knowledge commons and natural resource commons is a mistake. In fact, in almost all of the studies that deal with knowledge commons, one of the social dilemmas that gives rise to demand for governance is the management of rivalrous resources that are inputs to knowledge production. Right? So the shareable infrastructures that are rivalrous, just like natural resources. They even may be natural resources in some contexts. And in fact, and I said this last night to folks, and I've been saying it for about 10 years now, I just haven't had the resources to do it myself. If anyone wants to do it, let me know, we can do it together. Someone should go back and look at every single natural resource case study that has ever been done, every study that's been done, and look at the layer of knowledge commons or technology management commons that existed in that case study. I guarantee you will find every single study that's ever been done on a natural resource commons has a complementary knowledge or technology related commons sitting at a layer on top of it that's been under-examined. And we would learn a lot about the two things connecting with each other, and maybe even learn more about the natural resource commons we were studying if we were aware of, went back and studied those things. So that would be really neat. I guarantee you it exists, and I couldn't agree more that our separation of the thing, but we might need to separate the things so we can zone in, just like we did the rare disease and there was this nested structure. I had to zone in on the meso-level consortium, because you can't study everything at the same time always. So it might be that we separate knowledge commons from natural commons, not for the purposes of zooming in and studying something, but with an always being aware of the fact that they're related. In fact, we might even want to do follow-on studies that make the connections between the two. But I think that's exactly right. And the whole point about commoning is a better way to think about it. Well, I think one way what you might be saying is that the way to think about commons is about community rather than resources. I think it's both. I think it's almost always both. I think if you ignore the resources, you're ignoring something that really matters. But I think it's about commons is about governing resources and constructing communities. And what those communities look like with respect is partly related to what the resources are that you're talking about. So I think the things are all interdependent, related to each other. But I get the point. It's smart.
Yeah, very inspiring. And I personally have the feeling that the framework you propose is personally applicable also to seed commons, which is the focus here. I have just two questions. Did you, in some of the case studies, tackle two aspects? So one aspect is, I suppose, but maybe that's wrong, that in most of the case studies, the irrelevance of the place of the actors is built in, so it's by design a given. So are there case studies where not everybody of the community has a permanent or even volatile access to the internet and therefore is able to communicate? And the second question is, did you study communities where finding a common language, not scientific language, but natural language, is a real problem in connecting people?
I don't really have an answer. I'd have to go back and look at some of the cases to see if there is one or two, or some of them that do that. It wasn't the focus in particular of any that come to mind, but I'm intrigued. I think that the shared, especially the second point, not that the first one wasn't interesting also, but the second point is one that would be really interesting to look for. When is figuring out the common language with which we are going to communicate in order to govern one of the dilemmas we face? That's great. I just don't know. No examples jumping to mind. Maybe people have ideas.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brett, for your wonderful keynote. I think a lot of the issues that have come up, we will be able to go deeper into during the sessions. For example, with the material, informational, cultural aspects of commons. That will be one of the topics that will be discussed in the next session that is taking place here. So after a short coffee break, we will have the session on realizing and managing plant genetic diversity as a global commons from the global to the local level. That will take place here. And upstairs we will have the normative groundings of new commons session. And after lunch, then we have a session where we compare medical and seed commons. So this will also be interesting to see that we also in the medical field we have this issue of having material aspects and informational aspects. And Brett Frischmann will also give a comment in the session. So and this will also be here, and the other types of modern commons and the system effect, the other session will again be in room 2 upstairs. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you in the next session.